We're going to take a look at speciation and some misconceptions about evolution. There's two main types of speciation. So we're going to take a look at allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So in this picture here, we've got our original population of a tree species. And in allopatric speciation, we've got some sort of geographic isolation that will separate two populations. And there's been some mutations that have occurred between the two populations. And over time, because of the geographic isolation, maybe there's a mountain range in between these two populations, there's no longer any gene flow between the two populations, so they're no longer breeding between each other and exchanging genes, and so the two populations become isolated. And then over time, there's going to be selection for different traits between the two populations, and there eventually could be the development of new species that could occur. So that would be allopatric speciation. And then if you just take a look at the word allopatric, allo means other, and patric is referring to homeland. So they've got two different homelands or two different geographic areas that they're living in, and they're going to be separated by some sort of thing that will make it so they can't breed with one another. And then sympatric speciation, the two populations are not geographically isolated, but there's something going on that they're not reproducing together. So they're going to be reproductively isolated instead. And so we'll take a look at an example of that. So this is sympatric speciation. Sym means together or the same, and patric means homeland. So they're still living in the same area, but they're just not reproducing together. So they become reproductively isolated. So let's take a look at an example of allopatric speciation. And here we've got an example around the Grand Canyon. So on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, we've got Abert squirrel. And on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, we've got the kaibab squirrel. So originally, we had Abert squirrel in both areas, but what happened about 10,000 years ago was that the last ice age had occurred, and Abert squirrel was living down inside the Grand Canyon. And as the climate warmed, the bottom of the Grand Canyon was too hot, and so they moved up to where the ponderosa pine forests were up on the top of the north rim here. And then it just became too hot to live down in the Grand Canyon anymore. And so you still have the population of Abert squirrels living on the south rim, and then you had this isolated population living over here on the north rim. And over these 10,000 years, there's been some mutations in the group of Abert squirrels that were living here. And they've actually changed color, and they've actually developed some different behaviors as well. And so you can see the difference. They have a totally white tail, and they've also lost the white coloration on their belly and underneath their forelimbs. So they're just all kind of a blackish color. And so that's going to be different from the Abert squirrel. So we've got this geographic isolation now because of the Grand Canyon separating the north rim from the south rim. Okay, and then here's an example of sympatric speciation. And this is going on in a lake in Nicaragua. This is a volcanic lake. This is Lake Apoyeque. Sorry, I probably did not pronounce that right. So it's really small. And this species of cichlid fish was introduced into this small volcanic crater lake about 100 years ago. And over the past 100 years, there has been some differences that have evolved in this cichlid fish. So you can see that one group of the fish has thin lips and the other group of fish has thick lips. And that's because they've had some mutations and they're eating different types of food and hanging out in different areas of the lake. So the ones with the thick lips are feeding off of the among the rocks on the bottom, and they actually use the thick lips to protect them from the sharp edges of the volcanic rocks, and they kind of push their heads into between the rocks and kind of suck out the insects and things that are living in the sediment, and they will eat that, whereas the ones with the thin lips are living more up towards the surface, and they're eating the algae and snails and things that are living up near the surface. And so because they're living kind of in different areas of the lake and eating different things, they're breeding with, those groups that are living in those different areas of the lake. So even though they're living in the same lake, they are reproductively isolated and they're becoming different species. So that's sympatric speciation. So they're living in the same area, the same lake, but they're reproductively isolated. Okay, and then just some misconceptions about evolution. One misconception is that a lot of people think that evolution is just a theory. And so just for the general public, when you think of the word theory, a lot of people think theory is just a guess. And as scientists, a theory is something that's backed up with a lot of scientific evidence. So there's a misconnect on what the word theory means. So evolution has been backed up with a lot of scientific evidence, and it is not just a guess. Another misconception about evolution is that individuals evolve, and we've talked about this before. So remember that it's populations that evolve, but the individuals themselves do not evolve. And the reason that is because an individual is born with whatever genes you've got, and you cannot change those genes. You can't swap them out and say, oh, I need different genes because the environment's changed and my genes are not so good for the environmental conditions. So if your genes aren't so good for the environmental conditions, you may not survive to reproduce. So you're not going to pass those genes on. But the populations do evolve because those individuals that do have the advantageous genes will survive and then pass that on to their offspring, and then more individuals in the population will have those advantageous traits. Okay, and then another misconception about evolution is that evolution explains the origin of life. So evolution can't tell us how life formed on Earth. We have some ideas about how life might have formed on Earth, but nobody was around when it did form, so we really don't know for sure. But evolution can explain how life has diversified since life did form on Earth, and how all of these different species have come about and originated. So we can explain that with evolution, but we can't explain how life originated on Earth. And then another misconception about evolution is that organisms evolve on purpose. This idea that evolution is directed. It is not. Organisms can't say, oh, the environment is changing and, I need to evolve antibiotic resistance to survive, like bacteria. That just does not happen. Evolution is occurring just because of chance. There is some randomness to it because mutations are random. As far as is the mutation going to be beneficial? Is it going to help you survive the antibiotic? Maybe it's going to be detrimental. Maybe it's going to be a bad mutation and then it causes that individual to die. Or maybe it's neutral. Maybe it doesn't benefit or harm you. And the natural selection will, the environment is going to select for those individuals that have those traits that are advantageous in the environment at that moment. And then they survive and then will reproduce and then pass on those traits. And then the environment keeps changing. So something that's advantageous in the environment right now may not be advantageous later on. So for example, when we had ice ages, something advantageous during an ice age may not be so advantageous when we have global warming. So the environment does keep changing. Okay, and then natural selection can't create perfect organisms. This is just kind of going off of that last misconception that, organisms, direct evolution. So natural selection can only act on existing variations. So natural selection is not going to create new traits. Natural selection cannot cause mutations to occur. For example, like if you have bacteria and they've been exposed to an antibiotic, being exposed to that antibiotic is not going to cause them to develop a mutation and have a mutation that makes them antibiotic resistance. That's just random chance that they get a mutation to develop antibiotic resistance. But natural selection will select for those that do have a mutation that makes them resistant to the antibiotic resistance. The next thing is that evolution is limited by historical constraints. And this just goes back to, what the species were that were the common ancestors. What traits you have, that's what you've got to work with. A species can't completely start from scratch. It's not like, if humans want to develop wings, we can't just all of a sudden sprout wings on our back and start flying. We just don't have those structures. That just is not going to happen. The species has to work with what they've got and have mutations to, adapt and, kind of differentiate and change what they've got to adapt to the new environment. And then also adaptations are often compromises. So for example, if you look at the human shoulder, so our human shoulder has been adapted to give us a really great range of motion. We can reach really far and, all kinds of angles that we can reach around and grab things, which is great. But there's often trade-offs. So in order to have that great range of motion in our shoulder is not very stable. There's not a lot of support there. So it's really easy to injure our shoulder. So it's very easy to dislocate your shoulder or tear a rotator cuff. So unfortunately, there's some trade-offs, and natural selection is never going to create the perfect organism because of these things. Okay, and then just the last misconceptions about evolution. Another misconception is that evolution is controversial among scientists. Most scientists accept evolution as being true, and that's because there's so much scientific evidence that backs up evolution, and so scientists have accepted it as being true. The last misconception is that other theories should be taught in school besides evolution, such as creationism or intelligent design. That is not correct because creationism and intelligent design are not scientific theories. There's no way to test scientifically creationism or intelligent design. So those are more religious ideas, and science cannot be used to test religion. So that is just something that science can't say anything about. So it doesn't belong in a science class. So